Mid-February 1943. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel sat alone in a dimly lit command post near the Tunisian border. A single lamp glowed over a small wooden desk. Outside, the Afrika Korps was celebrating. Tanks were being refueled. Crews were laughing. Officers were slapping each other on the back. They had just destroyed the American army at Kasserine Pass. Rommel didn't celebrate. He was writing a letter. His pen scratched slowly across the paper as he chose each word carefully. "The Americans are soft," he wrote. "They lack discipline. Their officers are amateurs. Their units collapse under pressure." He paused. Outside, an engine revved. Somewhere, a soldier shouted in triumph. Rommel stared at the page. "We broke them in 6 days," he continued. "Over 6,000 casualties. Entire battalions surrendered. Their spirit cracked like the French in 1940. He set the pen down. This was not just a battlefield report. This was a verdict. Rommel believed he had just witnessed something rare in war. The moment an enemy realizes he is not meant for it. He signed the letter. Lucy. His wife would read it and know exactly what it meant. Germany could finish the Americans before they learned how to fight. 3 weeks later, that certainty would be dead. March 6th, 1943. A siren echoed through the dusty streets of a battered Tunisian town as a column of jeeps roared toward the headquarters of the defeated U.S. Second Corps. American officers looked up. One of them whispered, "That's him." George S. Patton, Jr. He arrived wearing polished boots, ivory-handled revolvers, and an expression that made grown men straighten their backs. He didn't smile. He walked inside and looked at the men who had lost at Kasserine. "You've been beaten," he said flatly. "That doesn't make you cowards, but it means something was wrong." No one spoke. "I'm here to fix it." Silence. "And some of you won't survive my fixing." Back in Tunisia, Rommel was studying maps. German intelligence briefed him on the American command change. Patton. The name didn't worry him. American generals came and went. They all failed the same way. Rommel waved it off. One man cannot change an army in 3 weeks. His staff nodded. So did Berlin. March 23rd, 1943. German tanks rolled forward at El Guettar exactly where Rommel had predicted the Americans would fold again. The plan was simple. Break them. Run them down. Prove Kasserine wasn't a fluke. German commanders waited for panic. They got artillery, not scattered fire, not hesitant. Perfectly synchronized explosions slammed into their armor. German radios erupted with screams. "We are taking heavy fire." Static. "The Americans are not retreating." Cut. German tanks began burning in the desert. Someone whispered in disbelief, "This isn't the same army." Rommel would never see El Guettar himself. He was already sick, already being flown out of Africa. But the reports reached him in Germany. American forces had not broken. They had counterattacked. They had held. They had killed. Rommel read the field summaries in silence. Then he said something that chilled the room. They learned. This is the story of the 3 weeks that changed the war. The 3 weeks that turned the Americans from Rommel's joke into his nightmare. Rommel did not underestimate enemies. That was what made his mistake so dangerous. In February 1943, after Kasserine Pass, he believed he finally understood the Americans. Not as propaganda, not as caricature, but as a fighting force. what he saw was deeply flawed. German intelligence officers brought him reports, maps, radio intercepts, prisoner interrogations, and they all told the same story. American units fought bravely when cornered, but they fell apart when pressed. Their radios became chaotic. Their officers lost control. Their formations dissolved. At Kasserine, German panzer divisions had sliced through them. Entire regiments broke. Others surrendered. Some never even fired. One captured American officer said something that stayed with Rommel. "We didn't know what to do when the tanks came." Rommel wrote it down. He knew exactly what it meant. The Americans weren't stupid. They weren't cowards. They were amateurs, untrained in modern war. Rommel had seen this before. The French in 1940, the Soviets in 1941, the British in the desert, armies that fought in straight lines while German armor moved like water. To Rommel, Kasserine wasn't just a victory. It was a diagnosis. A powerful nation trapped inside weak doctrine. Deadly someday, but not now. Not in March. In Berlin, Rommel's report was treated as gospel. Exploit their weakness immediately. Do not give them time. German doctrine was clear. When an enemy breaks, you destroy him. Another offensive would finish it. Guettar. The Americans would run again. The war would be won. What Rommel didn't know was that while he was writing letters, something brutal was happening inside American headquarters. March 7, 1943, George Patton stood inside a dusty command post, staring at an officer who couldn't tell him where his men were. "You don't know where your companies are?" No answer. "You're done." 20 years of service ended in one sentence, and then another, and another. Officers without helmets, officers behind the lines, officers who didn't know their own battlefield. Gone. A whisper spread through Second Corps. If you don't know your war, you don't belong in it. Fear followed, but so did clarity. Rommel believed armies needed months to change. Patton believed they needed terror. Terror of failure, terror of disgrace, terror of being sent home. And slowly, the army began to harden. German tanks were coming again. Rommel was sure of that. What he wasn't sure of was what kind of Americans they would meet this time. March 23, 1943, just before dawn. A thin, cold wind moved through the rocky hills outside Guettar, carrying dust and the smell of fuel. German tank crews sat inside their Panzer IVs with engines idling, their breath fogging the air, waiting for the order they believed would finish the Americans. 3 weeks ago at Kasserine Pass, those same Americans had broken. They had run. They had abandoned guns, trucks, wounded men. Field Marshal Rommel had written to Berlin that the Americans were amateurs, brave, but badly led, slow to react, brittle under pressure. If Germany struck again quickly, before they learned, the war in North Africa could be decided. This attack was that strike. In a command tent behind the lines, German officers studied their maps. The 1st Infantry Division, the big red one, held the sector ahead. At Kasserine, they had cracked. The plan was simple. Concentrate armor, smash through, roll them up. A German colonel said quietly, almost casually, "By nightfall, we will be drinking in the headquarters." At 6 a.m. the order came. The panzers moved. Tracks bit into the dirt, engines roared, long columns of steel rolled toward the American positions with the slow, confident rhythm of an army that had been winning wars this way for 4 years. Then, the ground exploded. Not in scattered impacts, not in probing fire. Everything hit at once. Shells slammed down across the German front line in perfect unison. Artillery from miles away, firing on Patton's new system of time on target. German tank crews were still scanning for American guns when the first wave landed. A panzer commander screamed into his radio, "Artillery! Heavy artillery! We are—" Static. Another voice cut in. "Our left flank is on fire! Where is the Luftwaffe?" There was no Luftwaffe. There was only more artillery. At Kasserine, American gunners had fired slowly, cautiously, often missing. At Guettar, every battery fired like part of a single machine. Shells walked across the German formations, blowing tracks off tanks, shredding infantry, crushing radio trucks. German officers tried to restore order, but the battlefield was dissolving into smoke and flame. Still, the panzers kept coming. That was their doctrine: close the distance, break through, force collapse. But when the German tanks crested the first ridgeline, American tank destroyers opened fire. Not from straight ahead, from the sides, from gullies, from rocky outcrops, from positions Patton had ordered dug days earlier. Shermans that would have died in frontal combat now struck German armor in the flank, where the steel was thinner. A Panzer IV burst into flames, then another. German gunners tried to pivot, but every time they turned, another American gun found them. Inside one German tank, a loader shouted, "They're everywhere!" The commander shouted back, "They shouldn't be. They're not supposed to fight like this." But the Americans weren't fighting like before. They weren't holding fixed lines and waiting to be crushed. They were falling back in controlled steps, pulling the Germans forward into layered kill zones, exactly what Patton had drilled into them after Kasserine. At Kasserine, fear had ruled. At Guettar, discipline did. American infantry held until ordered to withdraw. Then they moved back. Then they fought again. German radio intercepts picked up American voices. Calm, professional, unpanicked. "Able Company, shift fire to grid 3-4. Artillery, repeat last mission, adjust 50 meters. This wasn't an army breaking. This was an army working. By mid-morning, German units had advanced less than 2 miles and paid for every yard in burning steel and dead men. General von Arnim stared at his reports. Casualties rising. No breakthrough. American resistance increasing. This wasn't supposed to happen. 3 weeks ago, these men had fled. Now, they were killing Germans with methodical precision. By the afternoon of March 24th, the truth could no longer be denied. The offensive was failing. The order went out to withdraw. German units pulled back, leaving wrecked tanks and wounded behind. They had not been defeated by better weapons. They had been defeated by a changed army. Later, in Germany, Rommel would read the Guettar reports. He understood instantly what they meant. His February judgment that the Americans were soft was dead. Patton had killed it.
March 29th, 1943, Germany. A quiet room, a hard chair, a closed window that didn't let much spring air in. Erwin Rommel sat with his back straight,
but his body didn't look like the man who had once lived inside a tank and slept in sandstorms. His face was drawn. His skin still carried the dull tone of sickness. The doctors said he needed rest. Rommel didn't rest. A staff officer entered without ceremony and placed a folder on the table. Tunisia, After Action Reports, El Guettar. Rommel stared at the cover for a moment longer than necessary. Then he opened it. Paper doesn't sound like much, but in that room, the turning of those pages was loud. He began reading. At first, like a professional, not emotional, not defensive, just absorbing information. Enemy order of battle. German units engaged. Time of first contact. Artillery intensity. Tank losses. Withdrawal. His eyes narrowed at one line. American artillery fires achieved simultaneous effects across multiple battalion sectors. Rommel read it again. Simultaneous. That meant planning, training, a system. At Kasserine, he had heard that American artillery was slow, scattered, uncoordinated. Good guns handled by inexperienced hands. This report described something else. Something disciplined. Rommel turned the page, another line, underlined in pencil by whoever had compiled the summary. Enemy infantry did not collapse under pressure. Conducted controlled withdrawals to prepared positions. Rommel's jaw tightened slightly. A controlled withdrawal is not a retreat. A controlled withdrawal is a commander holding the mind of his units even while they are taking fire. That is what German doctrine demanded. And now, the report was saying the Americans were doing it. He paused, glanced at the edge of the folder, saw the second file underneath, a copy of a private letter, a month earlier, his own handwriting, to Lucy. The Americans are soft. Their officers are amateurs. Their units collapse under pressure. Rommel did not flinch, but his eyes stayed on those words for a long time. It wasn't that he felt shame. Rommel didn't have time for shame. He felt something colder, a calculation being forced to update. Because if the Americans were not soft, then Tunisia was not just a temporary problem. It was a warning about the rest of the war. A knock at the door. His aide entered carefully, as if Rommel might snap. "Field Marshal, do you want tea?" Rommel didn't look up. "No." The aide hesitated. "The staff has asked if you—" Rommel finally raised his eyes. "Leave." The aide left immediately. Rommel returned to the report. He reached the section labeled Enemy Command Behavior. German officers, trained to observe patterns, had recorded what they heard on intercepted American radio traffic. Not the words, the tone. American communications were calm. Orders were clear. No panic noted. Rommel leaned back slightly. Calm radio traffic under heavy attack meant one thing: leadership. Not at the top, at the point of contact. Company and battalion officers who knew what to do and did it without freezing. Rommel had always believed most armies didn't have that, not quickly, not in 3 weeks. Yet the evidence was here. He turned another page. Tank loss analysis. A note that American guns had been positioned for crossfire, that American units fell back into secondary kill zones, that German armor became exposed while pushing through artillery. Rommel's eyes narrowed again. Crossfire. Layered positions. Delayed trap lines. That wasn't American. That was professional. That was the kind of defense a German instructor would diagram on a chalkboard. Rommel's fingers pressed lightly against the paper. Then, almost without realizing it, he whispered a single sentence. Not to anyone, to the room itself. They learned. The words weren't admiration. They were alarm. Rommel sat forward and began making notes in the margin. Not dramatic, not emotional. Clinical. If Americans can adapt this fast, then you cannot plan against what they were last month. You must plan against what they will be next month. And that meant Germany's advantage, experience, was shrinking. Fast. He reached for a clean sheet and began writing an updated assessment for Berlin. His tone was not angry, it was sharp. American forces under new leadership have improved with abnormal speed. Future operations must not assume collapse under armored pressure. Artillery coordination now achieves decisive effects. American defensive conduct resembles professional European standards. Then he paused. He knew what Berlin would do with a report like this. Some would dismiss it. Some would say he was exaggerating. Some would say the Americans got lucky. But Rommel had made a living off reading patterns before they became disasters. This wasn't luck. This was systemic change. He wrote one last line, harder than the rest. The enemy is transforming. Do not underestimate their learning rate.
Outside that quiet German room, Tunisia was still burning. But the war had already shifted, because Germany could survive an enemy that fought like a beginner. Germany could even survive an enemy that had more factories. What Germany could not survive was an enemy that learned fast enough to turn factories into doctrine. May 1943, Tunisia was finished. More than 250,000 Axis soldiers laid down their weapons. Entire German and Italian armies walked into captivity. The Afrika Korps, once feared, once unstoppable, was gone. For Erwin Rommel, the Desert War had ended quietly months earlier, not with a surrender, but with a plane flight back to Germany and a body that no longer worked the way it once had. But the truth of that defeat didn't arrive in Berlin until the reports did. Rommel sat in another room, another stack of papers in front of him, same war, different feeling. This time the reports weren't about one battle. They were about a pattern. American forces advancing faster, American artillery crushing counterattacks, American units refusing to panic, American commanders pushing forward when German doctrine expected hesitation. Rommel read through the casualty tables. He did the math. Then he closed his eyes for a moment. Kasserine Pass had made him feel powerful. Guettar had made him uneasy. Tunisia had made him understand. Germany hadn't just lost a campaign. It had created an enemy. German generals began rewriting doctrine that summer. Not to beat the British, not to beat the Soviets, to beat the Americans. They warned that American forces no longer fought like amateurs. They warned that American artillery coordination was overwhelming. They warned that American commanders were now aggressive instead of cautious. But there was something else in those reports, something harder to quantify. Fear. Not of American weapons, of American speed of adaptation. The Americans had not needed years. They had not needed a generation of officers. They had not needed some slow cultural evolution. They had needed 3 weeks under the right commander. That was the terrifying part. Rommel had once believed he was watching a weak opponent learn slowly. Instead, he had watched a superpower wake up. By July 1943, Patton was in Sicily. By August, his armies were racing across the island faster than German forces could retreat. By 1944, American forces under Patton were tearing through France so fast, German commanders couldn't draw maps quickly enough to keep up. And by December, when Germany launched its last great gamble in the Ardennes, Rommel was gone. But his warning came true. The Americans did not hesitate. They did not pause. They did not take weeks. They counterattacked in days. The same army that had broken at Kasserine now smashed back through Bastogne. And German officers, sitting in cold bunkers and frozen forests, realized something Rommel had understood first. The Americans weren't slow anymore. They were relentless. Rommel had once written that the Americans were soft, that they lacked the hardness of European armies. He was right. They weren't hard. They were something far more dangerous. They were flexible. They could change. And in war, the army that can change faster than its enemy wins. Not because it is braver, not because it is smarter, but because it refuses to stay what it was when it failed. The Germans never lost to the Americans they fought in February 1943. They lost to the Americans those men became. And that transformation, born in 3 brutal weeks under George Patton, did not just defeat Rommel in North Africa. It followed Germany all the way to Berlin.